Lynn, thank you so much. For secular humanistic Jews, where self-identification is such an important factor in Jewish identity, you have shown us that when dealing with people in general and dealing with the children of intermarriage particularly, this is not a simple either-or categorical situation. And you have opened us up to the beautiful stories of four people and helped us grapple with the complexity of this issue, and I thank you very much. We have, I would say, 20 minutes. Can we go that late, till 4:20? And open it to questions. Zev.
First, I want to say thank you because I thought that was fascinating. I wish you could have been sitting up here when Lynn was talking about Jews and race and seen your faces. It was quite a picture. What I wanted to ask is, if you know, the third category, which is to say those fewer Jews who are half Jews or born of one Jewish parent who regard themselves as Christian. How do they feel about it? How do they feel about that part of them which is Jewish or was Jewish? Are they negative about it? Are they oblivious to it? Are they interested in it?
That's a very good question. In general, though there were only 6, so it's very hard to speak broadly about it, several of them felt that they came to identify as Christian because they really felt excluded by their Jewish relatives. And this woman I described with the blonde curly hair really wanted to be included by her father's Jewish family. She even gave a bar mitzvah for her son, and none of her father's relatives would come. After that, she said, "I'm Christian. I give it up." And so I think that the failure of Jewish families to include an intermarried child-in-law accounted in some ways for their turning to Christianity.
Bottom of the thing. There you go.
No, it's on the top. Push it up.
It's not catching. Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks. Lynn, I also want to thank you for wonderful talk and make 2 observations which you can respond to. First is that I'm really fascinated by the impact of the Holocaust on the identity of these people and the sort of urban myth that if you were 1/16 Jewish, you got hauled off. Of course, not true. I mean, we know that for the most part, it was only full Jews. The Mischling, people of mixed race, as they were called, were largely spared. But of course, that doesn't change the overall sense that the Nazis were using a racial definition. And the way in which that's filtered down and affected identity. And I see that in my own students, as I teach this very large course, and I have a lot of students who will come and talk to me and say, I'm, in fact, half Jewish, and that's why I'm in this course, and because this particularly is of interest to me. And I used to teach at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, which is a consortium of 9 Protestant and Catholic seminaries, and I directed Center for Jewish Studies there, and so I would get all kinds of really weird stories. I remember one time these 2 guys from the Jesuit school came to see me, and one of them says to me, he says, look at my face, it looks like the map of Israel. I was born, both of my parents are Jewish, and then I had this epiphany when I was 13, I became a Christian, and the other one, whose name was Italian, my mother's Jewish, and they said, here we're both becoming ordained as Jesuit priests, and we're trying to figure out what to do about these facts. Sort of belatedly, they're trying to figure this out, and they had the idea that they would have Cardinal Lussiger from Paris perform their ordination as a kind of a statement that you could still be Jewish and Catholic, and they wanted to know how I thought that was going to go down in the Jewish community. I had to disabuse them of this idea that somehow we create peace between Jews and Catholics. But it's very interesting to encounter these cases and to try to do them non-judgmentally and see this is where Jewish identity is, and we have to be aware of it. We have to think it through in a much more complicated way.
I was absolutely fascinated by what you had to say. I really enjoyed it. It was wonderful. Thank you. I mean, it was really news. But let me just say two things. First of all, I always test people. People will tell me, I'm proud to be Jewish. And I said, I'm really glad because you look Jewish. It's always, there's all this ambivalence about what it means to look Jewish. In fact, people will often pride themselves on not looking Jewish. They're proud, but they love not to look Jewish. Another thing which I find so interesting in the community, we have the great controversy in the Jewish community are Messianic Jews. They want to be Jews. So they have, a Jesus as the Messiah. They're no different from the Lubavitchers who want Schneerson, do you understand, as the Messiah. And yet, I'm telling you, people go absolutely through the. You can't have dual identity. So you've raised three very important things I'd like you to respond. First of all, is the issue of dual identity. That is, for instance, at one time, the idea that you could have both American and Canadian citizenship was intolerable. Americans believed that if you have American citizenship, you can't have any other citizenship in the world. You can only have one. You're either American or out. And now the idea of dual citizenship is what? I mean, you can belong to more than two states, right? Two nations if you choose to. So is it possible, maybe in the future, in this rapidly increasing numbers of people will have dual identity, and that Israel would allow it. Brother Daniel, remember him? The Catholic Jewish controversy. Can you be Jewish ethnically and Catholic by? I mean, the whole thing. No. Even the Orthodox Jews came out, right? Am I right? Yeah, they were against it. So the question now is it possible to have dual identity? Can people be part of the Jewish community and also be part of others? Now, let me just tell you about what I've discovered. You can be Jewish and Buddhist because Buddhists never persecuted Jews. Or you can do Tibetan tantric things, whatever they are, and Jewish, because we have no record of the Tibetans ever persecuting Jews. But Jewish and Catholic, I mean, becomes very, very difficult. But it's very interesting because we're going to have to deal with that more and more. The second thing is, I grew up with my rabbi always saying that the primary thing in my life is being Jewish. Well, what if being Jewish is number 6 on your priority list? You get kicked out of the organization. See, what we want Jews to do is either you make us number 1 or you're out. But if a person has multiple identities and multiple interests and all these connections in an individualized society to keep insisting that it be number 1, maybe there are all these wonderful people who could be part of us and it's really number 4 or number 5 or number 6. And the third is, if that's the case, if that's what's evolving, what are the institutions that we need to create in our society that we don't presently have to respond to this population, because otherwise they're not going to be served appropriately. For instance, it may be the case that congregations will have to become, or communities, more like service centers. People now can drop in for a Buddhist weekend. Then they can drop in for a Jew. No, do you understand what I'm talking about? Because those are the kinds of people you're talking about. So what does it mean in terms of the institutional life of our society? Because we're so tied to conventional patterns.
I think those are some really interesting questions. In response to the first, I have to respectfully disagree. I think that you can have dual identities, and America is
Well, I'm
increasing.
not disagreeing with you.
Oh.
I was just pointing out the problem.
Okay.
I wasn't being negative.
Okay, because more and more people are having Jewish dual identities. Think of the Vietnamese, the soldiers in Vietnam who brought home Vietnamese wives. Think of all the ethnic intermarriage there is, and the American census now finally recognizes people have dual identities. Whether you can be Jewish and Catholic, I think that that's an interesting question.
Because they
One of the things that I've learned is that what people do is put together what I call, what other sociologists and anthropologists call syncretic practices, practices that derive a little bit from here, a little bit from there. For example, in my unsynagogued Jews study, I interviewed this woman who really took several people who took New Age practices and labeled them as Jewish. So, like Bethany, I had somebody who on Yom Kippur decided not to go to synagogue, but rather to climb up this wonderful mountain, and it was a bright, sunny, shiny, crispy day. And she said, that was the most Jewish spiritual experience I've ever had. Now, I know, again, you'll say that's like Buddhists. You can be New Age and do New Agey things and still be Jewish. What about Catholic? I think that question remains to be seen. I think we can't yet know the answer to it.
What if you're culturally Jewish and culturally Catholic, as opposed to what I would call burned in ideologically?
The people I interviewed who had a Catholic parent, and in Providence, which is a heavily Catholic, or Rhode Island, a heavily Catholic state, nearly all the intermarriages were with Catholics. But nobody identified as culturally Catholic. Culturally, they took on the ethnicity of the non-Jewish parent. I think your question about institutions is a great one. And that, I think, is one we really will need to think about. But again, in my neighborhood, there's a synagogue that one Saturday a month offers Buddhist meditation services in a synagogue. So it's a conservative synagogue. So under one roof, we have, sometimes they call it Buddhist meditation, sometimes they call it Jewish meditation. Is it all that different? I'm not sure.
Lynn, I wanted to talk, I'm going to be the dumb goy. Or to put it another way, to be the one who doesn't know which question not to ask. When you first mentioned one of your interviewees talking about Judaism as having a biological factor, the audience started laughing, giggling. So I wrote a little note to Zev, why is that funny? I was truly perplexed. And he wrote, embarrassing. And I wrote, but true. And he wrote, but Hitler. So I think I know what that means, but I hope you'll explain it to me a little bit better. I mean, it seems to me that you can't, as Jews worry about Tay-Sachs disease, without acknowledging that there's a biological relationship generally among Jews, and I think that there is a fair amount of scientific study. For example, there have been studies on the Kohanim. It's not a coincidence, apparently, that people whose last name is Cohen have similar DNA, whether they're living in Jerusalem or in Paris. And also, as far as there being a Jewish look, this notion of ambivalence about a Jewish look, I have to say, doesn't exist in Israel. And I think that might have something to do with the fact that, in the diaspora, I don't know, you're all hiding from Nazis and getting pale and spending all your time reading books and having to wear eyeglasses. I remember the first time, and this was my idea of what Jews were, and the very first time that I remember I was on the beach in Tel Aviv. I had just arrived in Israel, and my God, there were these gorgeous people running around, tan and fit and handsome, and I thought, the Jews are pretty hot, So you just get...
And then she met me.
Oh, well. The last thing I want to say on this subject is that it's interesting to me that there's a resistance, it seems to me, among Jews to think of yourselves as a people, as a race, because that's how Hitler thought of you and he killed you. But there's an interesting inverse to this, which is that years and years ago, just at the time of the Oslo Peace Accord's first signing, I interviewed Yasser Arafat. And he had not yet gone to Gaza. He was still in Tunis, so this was all very fresh and new. And I asked him, you know, what if you had been born a Jew in Jerusalem instead of a Palestinian in, well, he says he was born in Jerusalem. He wasn't really, but anyway. And he was actually born in Egypt. But he refused to answer the question, so I asked it again, and he changed the subject, and I asked it again, and he changed the subject. And then his spokesman called a break. And he pulled me aside and he said, stop asking that damn question. He said, you have to understand that from our point of view, we cannot allow ourselves to believe that Jews are anything but a religion. Because if Jews are a people, then they have the right to have their own state. And if they're merely a religion, then they can be part of our state. And they can live here, you know, in part of a binational, well, they wouldn't call it binational because it's not two nations as far as they're concerned. You're all a bunch of Arabs, and you just happen to have two religions or three religions. So it's interesting that, you know, if you're responding to that attitude, you have to have a peoplehood. You have to have a race, if you will.
I think that's a fascinating series of observations, and it points out, and of course I'm biased because I'm a sociologist, it points out a basic sociological observation, which is that context is everything. So that in Israel, these Jews look really hot and they're proud to look Jewish, whereas in America, there's a different cultural context. And so first of all, because for so long Jews stood out and were stigmatized for looking Jewish, there's still a hesitation. Also, we're right now going through a phase, at least in the context I live and work in, like Brown University, of high doses of PC-ness, political correctness. And in the context of political correctness, we're questioning whether anything is innate or whether things are all social constructs. So for example, gender, which you might think obviously is biological, is being highly interrogated as whether gender is inborn or whether it's socially constructed. And people look at cross-cultural studies to say female bodies and male bodies do very different things in different cultures. Similarly with sexuality, people are questioning whether sexuality is something we're taught or whether sexuality is innate. And there's a lot of literature by gays and lesbians who argue both sides. And some want to claim it's innate because then nobody can say, you can change this deviant kind of thing. And many want to claim that it's a construction, that sexuality is a construction. And what we think is sexy is really shaped by our culture. And so I think the best answer I can give you is that it's really the larger cultural context here where many people are moving away from ascriptive categories and feel more comfortable thinking about social construction.
Derek, Yehuda, and then Zev.
Your talk opens up a whole new lens on something I've been thinking about in connection with nationalities and ethnicities, again, in general in the world. There's a Chinese historian named Prasenjit Dwara who's written a wonderful book about ethnicity and nationality in China. And he lays out a framework that we could use very easily for the Jews, which has to do with the distinction between what he calls hard boundaries and soft boundaries. And the hard boundaries are obviously, they can be religion, they can be language. What I would suggest is that in the case of your interviewees, what used to be historically the hard boundaries have now become soft and vice versa. So for example, historically language was a very important distinction between Jews and Gentiles, Hebrew, Yiddish versus the vernacular. Now, how many Jews are fluent in Hebrew or Yiddish? Dress used to be a hard distinction. Now it's soft. But on the other hand, the soft distinctions, folkways, customs, cooking, you know, gefilte fish, cholent, bagels and cream cheese, or even things like a mordant and self-deprecating sense of humor become the hard boundaries. So this is a reversal of what the standard nationality theory lays out in your case.
Interesting. Yehuda.
I'd like to join in expressing my appreciation of a wonderful paper. This business of identity, the case of Father Oswald Rufeisen in Israel, who wanted to become, he was an Israeli citizen, because you don't have to be Jewish to be an Israeli citizen. But he wanted to be recognized in his identity card as being Jewish, and the Orthodox establishment opposed that. And I thought that in a society just like this could be overcome. And when I suggested in the secular humanistic movement to put in a kind of a statement that would, in fact, provide Rufeisen with the possibility of joining if he left the Carmelite order, obviously. As long as he remained there, he would hardly qualify as a secular humanist. But if he wanted to join a group like that, it was rejected by an overwhelming majority of this movement.
Well, that was in Brussels in 1988.
That was in Brussels. Well, Brussels is, I know it's not in America, but it's part of us. Okay. So we are also bound by certain traditional views that, to my mind, in my eyes, are unacceptable. This leads me to another observation. Racism. It wasn't only Lisa that saw this. I saw this as well. It was a unpleasant kind of thinking, The truth of the matter is that racial theory influenced Jewish thinking. And during the early period of the Nazi regime, Jews accepted, some Jews, by no means all of them, by no means perhaps even the majority of them, but some Jews accepted the elements of racist theory. And this has remained with us. Now, it's true that when a Jewish woman in Jerusalem today talks about Schwarze, she doesn't mean black, she means religious extremists. But but it's still there. It's still there. And I think that what you discovered in your interviews is tremendously important for anyone who wants to not only reflect attitudes, but also try to change them in some way. And this becomes a universal problem. It's not just a Jewish problem. It's a universal problem. And the people that you interview are sort of somewhere on the boundary in terms of kind of sociological or historical thinking between a Jewish issue, problem, whatever, and a very, very universal one. And I think that this very boundary is terribly Jewish, don't you think? So that we are a mixture, sure. And it's true, Kohanim probably derive from some kind of common ancestry. But, in the 1st century AD, the Jewish people multiplied by a factor of 2.5, which is inexplicable in terms of natural increase. So we are a combination of just about everything you can possibly imagine on the other hand, which was brought home to me, personally when I joined the Anglo-Catholic monastery, because I thought I didn't know anything about Christianity, so I wanted to learn. And the person who opened the door was no other but Father Cohen.
Thanks for your kind comments. And I'd like to expand a little bit on your comment about how in the 20th century, Jews in Germany used the language of race. In fact, in the US, in the 19th century, When Jews were being excluded by the Anglo-Saxons, they were excluded like the Italians, like the Poles, like the Slavs, because they were seen as racialized. Now, what's particularly fascinating there is not only were they being racialized by the Anglo-Saxons, but there were many Jews, particularly some of the reformers, who themselves adopted the language of race, so that many Jews wanted to be seen as a race and not as a religion, so that way they wouldn't stand out from their neighbors in terms of their religion. But David Einhorn, for example, explicitly used the language of race to talk about what we are as a people. So it goes back further in time, and I'm not a historian, but I would love to know how far back that construction goes among what Jews say about themselves.
I'd like to ask you another question about this very high percentage of Holocaust fixation among people who probably personally never experienced any kind of racial prejudice or religious prejudice. And I want to also tie it in with something that Sherwin said about being, let's say, Jewish and Catholic at the same time, and the unwillingness of American Jewry in general to accept that. That it's okay to be, as you said, Eastern religion and Jewish because there was no history of persecution, but not Catholic or presumably Muslim. As I'm sure Yuda knows, in 1948-49, there was a big immigration of Bulgarians to Israel, about 25,000, I think, a little bit more. And many of these Bulgarians were, in fact, not Jewish, and not Jewish in any way. They simply lived in villages where there had been Jews, and when the Jews left, they took their neighbors with them. There were people who wanted to leave Bulgaria. And over the course of a generation or so, the Jews of Bulgaria, that is to say mostly the Jews of Yafo and a few other places in Israel, became Israelis in good standing. And that, I think, is because in Israel you have an index or a way to include yourself in the loyalty question. If you're with, you join the same army, you're on our side of this divide. If American Jews are so fearful of persecution in some distant place, in some place which is detached from their actual experience, then isn't it possible that the question of loyalty then becomes a big issue in the American Jewish community vis-a-vis its attitude toward people who are out of the community? That is to say, maybe American Jews are afraid to have people who are loyal, let's say, to more than just Judaism, for whom Judaism isn't the first priority, as you say, but the fourth or fifth, because they're afraid that this will dilute the self-defense mechanisms of the community. Is that possible?
I think Orthodox Jews certainly see it that way, that they think that if it's not your first identity, it's diluted, and it will get diluted further down the generations.
Sure.
I'm not sure about my respondents. What I can say for sure is that the same Holocaust fixation that I found among the adult children of intermarriage, I found among my unsynagogued Jews.
Sure, among everyone.
Right, and there's still a notion, even among, I don't know, I experienced one incident of anti-Semitism. It wasn't directed at me, but I taught at Wellesley College for 1 year after I got my PhD. And during the year I taught at Wellesley, there was a swastika painted on the dining room hall, on the wall in the dining room. Why would that happen in 1987 at Wellesley College? And it's incidents like